So a very, very warm welcome to our Hive Minds session, which is the Young Foundation's roundtable series on peer and participatory research. My name is Sian White. I'm the Head of Strategic Design and Insight with the Foundation, and I'm chairing our discussion today with speakers as we focus on the topic of funding a more participatory future for citizen science. Today's session is co-hosted by UK Research Innovation and the Institute for Community Studies. For those of you that don't know as much about the Institute of Community Studies is a new kind of research institute with people at its heart. It's powered by the Young Foundation, and we work to influence change, bridging the gap between communities, evidence and policy making. And we've been working really closely with colleagues at UKRI in their work around citizen science. And we're really excited to be in conversation with you today and sharing some of the things that we've been learning and thinking together. So in terms of the format for today's session, some of you might be familiar with how our Hive Mind sessions work. The first hour will be a series of talks from our three speakers before we move into a Q&A session. So to introduce our speakers that we have today, we're going to have first of all a talk from my colleague, Dr. Helena Hollis from the Institute of Community Studies, who'll be talking a bit about kind of our learnings from the UKRI Citizen Science Exploration grants process, and actually a little bit about kind of what we've learned around the kind of research designs and funding designs, and prompting us to think a little bit about some of those learnings. We'll then be handing over to colleagues from UK Research Innovation's public engagement team. So I'd like to introduce our colleagues Jen Grove and also Steve Scott. And Jen will be sharing a little bit of a story and journey that UKRI have been going on in thinking about citizen science and participatory research. We'll then kind of close our speakers with my colleague Alice Bell, also from the Institute of Community Studies, who'll be sharing a little bit about some of the work we've been doing recently with UKRI and talking a little bit about the citizen science collaboration grants as well. And a warm welcome to the grant teams that are in the room today. After these three talks, I'll be doing a little bit of gentle chairing of questions that you may have. We really hope that it'll get you thinking about what you might want to ask. As we go along, we'll do the three kind of talks first, and then we'll move into question and answers. Do feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll be keeping an eye on that and starting to come to them as we move into the discussion. We would ask, there's going to be quite a lot of you today, so please keep yourself on mute as we kind of go through the different presentations. What we'll then do is, after that first hour, we're really conscious of the experience and expertise and conversation that we can have in this room. So we'll be facilitating a kind of networking breakout space in the second hour. More on that later on as we go. So if that's all clear, I think we're good to go and start our conversations today about funding a more participatory future for citizen science. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to my colleague Helena, who'll take us through our first talk. Helena, over to you.
Hello, good morning. So this is going to be the mandatory moment where I say, are you seeing my slides? Is this working? Yes, Sian is nodding. Excellent. Okay, so I will speak a little bit and we'll move on to the other speakers. I will just warn people I can't necessarily see your face while I'm presenting, or so if anything's going wrong, I'm just trusting that somebody will shout that at me. So Sian has already explained the structure for the day. So I will start right off with my part. We've titled my talk "The Value of the Nitty-Gritty," which I hope will become clear as I speak through it. I'm going to speak about a very specific, I suppose, set of research projects and a particular piece of work that we at the Institute for Community Studies did looking to understand these projects. So UKRI funded a set of citizen science projects called the Citizen Science Exploration Grants. I see some familiar names in the room, so if you are one of the researchers from these grants, it's lovely to see you. It's great to have you here. And that little quote on this slide, which I won't read out because hopefully you can read it, I think articulates some of where I suppose UKRI's thinking and motivation was about these. I think really these were pilot studies. They were, as the name suggests, exploratory. And I think the idea of kind of diversity of project and people taking part in projects was really important. So we conducted an evaluation after the end of all of these projects, once they had all finished. And, don't worry too much about the very text heavy slide. I think the essence of what I would say about our evaluation approach was that we were not in any way evaluating whether projects were good or bad projects. We were not comparing different research projects against each other. Where we came to this and what we wanted to do was to see if we could understand something about citizen science as a methodology and see what we could learn from across this rich pool. I should have said it was 28 funded projects. So across that diverse set of different research pieces, what we could come to understand. And that's a little bit of what I'll be sharing with you today. I will just flag that this has resulted in quite an extensive research report, which is available to you. You're very welcome to read that. It would not be possible for me to sort of present all of our many, many findings, so please do read the report. Today, what I'm focusing on are some themes, which I think particularly for me, as I was engaged in this research, they stayed with me. I've still been thinking about these things, and I think they're interesting for further conversation. So firstly, in order to conduct this evaluation, we were given access to the final reports that these researchers produced for UKRI. And these were not reports that people were writing to publish, to put out in the world. And they were really quite process driven, I would say. So they described the whole research journey, and they described, what didn't work and how projects had to adapt to that. I should have said all of these projects were fairly horrifically impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. For most of them, they were going into their engagement with their different participants just as lockdowns kicked in. So that formed a big part of that challenge. But in general, I think it was really interesting and extremely valuable to read and understand how researchers had to change what they were doing and adapt and be flexible. And that is very, very different to what you would typically get if you read about research in, let's say, a journal article, which is presenting a very polished, finalized, and I would say quite sort of fixed version of what the research was about, rather than this more journey focus, which I think is interesting for us to think about. Perhaps obvious, but another theme that I think is an important one is that citizen science is all about the citizens. It's about the C and CS. Throughout, reading these reports and also discussing this with different researchers in interviews and in roundtable sessions, what came across so strongly was that not only were the people taking part in the research, learning things about the different topics of the research, from, astrophysics through to environmental issues, but actually that learning was happening in a very two-way process. Many researchers were talking about what they learned from the people who they got to engage with in these projects. And often that learning was sort of unexpected and a bit different to what might have been planned for or predicted. And then I think these projects, spanned a plethora of approaches, but in some cases, participants were really involved in making decisions about the research. And here, it really came across strongly that that was seen as beneficial and positive. And where people were able to perhaps change the direction the research was going with, or tweak specific ways it was being conducted, that was seen as leading to positive outcomes and improving the way that research worked. And what was interesting to me was across this particular, obviously it's a particular set, but across these 28 projects, in some cases, the researchers moved towards including more and more of that participation. But we didn't really see any examples where, involving people in those research decisions didn't work, and we didn't really see examples where that was sort of being cut back. So that to me was an interesting direction. What I will say here is that we really wanted to engage directly with the citizen scientists, with the participants in this research. And there were a variety of reasons why we were not able to do that. We were doing this evaluation after the projects had finished, and that meant that in almost all cases, people's data was not being stored anymore. In many cases, people were participating anonymously anyway. So that, you know, to us was a little disappointing, but still I think it came through so strongly how in citizen science, it is the citizens who are at the heart of that methodology. And then the last sort of theme that I will pick out that emerged for me really strongly, like looking at all of these different projects, was that, you know, wherever we talk about citizen science or similar methods being really positive and having lots of plus sides, there's always a sort of a tension and a balance that we need to be conscious of. And I think we need to be honest about with that. You know, I think going back to my point about documenting the whole research journey, seeing the sort of warts and all challenging, difficult parts of research is really important. And we can learn so much from that. But it's difficult to do that while at the same time being in perhaps an advocacy role where we're arguing for more people to adopt these methods. And I think that that's an interesting balance for us to be conscious of. As I mentioned, you know, we wanted to involve participants in our evaluation, but we weren't able to do that. And I think that points to another tension around, you know, wanting people to have space to engage as much as possible in research processes and be active decision makers in research, but at the same time respecting boundaries and being conscious that that will not be suitable for everyone, and won't always work. And how we sort of navigate that, I think, is another interesting tension. And lastly, again, what emerged quite strongly, particularly because of the particular kind of issues that many of these projects faced, is that being open and being flexible about how we conduct research is really important, but that's very difficult when we, you know, put in research proposals that have to be really structured. And there's a tension there between having openness and having flexibility, but meeting the sort of requirements, I suppose, of the formal research world. So these are, you know, I suppose, areas where I think it's interesting for us to think about those tensions and find balance, but I don't think there are easy or clean answers. And so to kind of lastly, as part of this conversation, I'd like to share some of our recommendations from this piece of work. On the next slides, you'll see sort of summaries of all of our recommendations, but I'm not going to speak to all of them because it would take a very long time. So again, I would encourage anyone who's interested in the full set of recommendations to read the report because it is available publicly. So firstly, we were able to identify some research design recommendations. So for people who are planning research and thinking about how to do it, these are some of the things we thought would be valuable. I will just speak to that first one in the list here. So I mentioned this idea that learning and the sharing of knowledge happened kind of two ways between researchers and between participants, and often in ways that were surprising and unexpected. And I think there's an element there where planning for that, and that means planning space, allowing time and allowing moments of engagement between researchers and the people taking part in the research, is a really important thing to do in order to kind of allow for learning to happen that maybe goes beyond what you might have envisaged when you were conceiving your research project in the first place. And then, of course, there are many other recommendations here. We also found some recommendations for the way that funding is designed to support citizen science and other participatory research approaches. And these really we're thinking for anyone who is interested in funding such work or commissioning research of this kind. That would be the audience for these, I suppose. And again, I'm just going to touch on that first point here. Obviously, we were evaluating exploration projects, so there was an inherent sort of need for them to be innovative in some way, exploring different things. But actually what emerged for us as well was that it's really important to provide funding that enables consolidation of learning, that enables, you know, documentation of all the different things that could have been learned through the process, and that enables the creation and kind of facilitation of infrastructure that can help the different relationships formed, the different ways of working to continue beyond a kind of perhaps short project. And again, there are other recommendations here as well. So For me personally, having worked on this evaluative piece, as well as our wider citizen science work, which my colleague Alice will speak to in a moment, I think we might be seeing some new directions in citizen science and perhaps in other participatory approaches that are interesting to me. I think we might be starting to see more diversification in the kinds of research outputs that people might be thinking of creating, and different ways of documenting how research is done. And I find that quite exciting. I think that's an interesting area for development. I think we might be seeing different ways of people collaborating together to do research, particularly between people who are within academia, inside of kind of formal research institutions, and people in wider communities who are doing research or interested in research outside of those formalized structures. And that to me is extremely exciting and interesting. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that continues to develop. And I think also, you know, there might be more appetite, more acceptance of more open forms of research design, where people are perhaps pushing back a little against ideas of research needing to be perfectly pre-planned. You might completely disagree with all of these, or you might have entirely different points that you think are interesting for the future of research of this type. And I would love to hear your thoughts when we get into the discussion section of our day later. But that is all from me at this point, and I am going to pass on now to my colleague Jen, who will be able to speak to you a bit about UKRI's, I suppose, thinking in all of this. So Jen, I will hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Helena. Can everyone hear me?
We can.
Great, thank you. So yeah, my name's Jen. I'm in the public engagement team here at UKRI, and we are a funder of research and innovation. So as Helena said, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background and a sort of context to why we commissioned this report, but also how this is part of our ongoing exploration of how we fund this kind of work. And also how it's informed our future direction in terms of how we support this way of working. So as I say, this report is part of an ongoing exploration of how we fund citizen science projects, but also other forms of participatory research. And I can see this has already kind of come up in the chat that we're using citizen science in this context for this event as quite a broad term to encompass lots of different ways in which the public directly can be involved in research. But we do recognise that citizen science isn't necessarily a relatable term for some disciplines, but also can be quite problematic for some communities, for example, people who aren't citizens. So we're using this term, but we are also kind of moving towards using more terms such as participatory research, or other terms that, as I say, directly involve people, that describe how to directly involve people in research. So just that's kind of a bit of an aside, and maybe we can pick that up in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So as Helena said, the exploration grants for citizen science launched in 2019. And at that point, we also launched the UKRI vision for public engagement. And within that vision, this included a goal to actively involve a wide range of people in the work of research and researchers. And so we launched the exploration grants as a way of exploring how to meet this aim. And what I wanted to talk to you today about is kind of give you a bit of a journey of how we've moved from that vision to our first UKRI public engagement strategy that we're about to launch literally and hopefully in the next week or so. And to just sort of show the journey that we've been on and how the exploration grants have informed that journey, along with other programs that we've learned from. So as Helena said, we really wanted to understand the challenges and the successes of these projects, what worked well and what didn't work well in terms of how we can we can share this for other people doing this kind of work and share it with the wider sector, such as this event today. But I think, as Helen sort of showed you, it was also really important for us to understand how, from these projects and from other programs we've been funding, how we can better design our funding to support this kind of work that brings together the public, citizens and researchers working collaboratively. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to kind of pick out a few of the highlights for us that we've learned from the exploration grants, but also from other programs that we've been running in the last few years. So one of the things that we recognized, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, is the importance of citizen-led responses, particularly to social challenges. So thinking about the kind of broad, the breadth of work that's happened in this area, and thinking about particularly how citizens and the public can be really engaged and really kind of motivated also to engage with research to meet particular social challenges, particular challenges that they see in their communities and their places that they live. We also, as Helen has touched upon, we saw really the value of co-producing or co-delivering research with the public and informing that kind of direction of the research project, as well as the sort of data collection side of citizen science. So that's something that really came out powerfully, particularly in Helena's report. Again, something that Helen has touched upon, we saw the real value of that kind of open and honest feedback from projects. So telling us what worked, but also what didn't work, and feeling that they were able to do this, that they're comfortable. And I guess this is kind of, it's part of us trying to say at UKRI, we're not expecting perfection, particularly with exploration grants, particularly with these kind of pilot projects. We recognize that lots of flexibility was needed for these projects, particularly as Helena said, because they were delivering in the time of COVID, but for lots of other reasons as well. We also recognise the importance of supporting partnership working between researchers and external groups, particularly those kind of external underrepresented communities or marginalised communities and groups, and particularly around power dynamic. And so we recognise that we need to support that better. We need to provide better support so that those kind of power dynamics can be navigated, can be hopefully mitigated when people are working with communities. And we also, as Helen has said, we recognise that we needed to much better foreground citizens' experience in how we support these projects, and particularly how we support the evaluation of citizens' experience from the beginning of the project. And finally, we heard from the projects, and as I say, we've learned from other programs that we've been running, that a program-wide support package would have been really, really useful, would be really valuable to bring together the cohort of projects working on these in these different ways to involve citizens and the public in their work, and to be able to share learnings between themselves. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, can you click on again? Just, and again? Thank you, cheers. Just animations there. So as I say, what we've learned from these exploration grants, but also from other programs we've been running, has really kind of has informed the future direction for UKRI in terms of funding this kind of work. So for example, at the moment, you can see on this slide, we're funding 5 longer term projects through our collaboration grants, which are running, they'll all be finished by 2024, and these are very much aimed at spreading citizen science or participatory research right across disciplines. So we're funding across a broad range of disciplines there, and we're also working with the Food Standard Agency to explore. We're funding 6 projects where researchers and the public are working together to explore a range of issues around food safety. And the collaboration grants have very much informed the design of these calls and how we support these projects, and particularly how we support the citizens involved in these projects. So for example, the event that you're attending today is part of a training package for the collaboration grants project. So this is a kind of part of the support package that they receive is about kind of skills development, is about looking at the kind of development needs that the projects need, and also their citizens' needs, and how we can meet those. But also within that support package for projects, it's about, as I've said before, the kind of cohort building, that sharing, the maximising learning between projects, but also the maximising the learning for us as UKRI. And what we've learned is that having direct contact with projects regularly really helps us to learn directly from those projects, but also kind of reinforce that idea that we are really we want that kind of honest feedback from grantees, and to build that trust between the grantees and the funder, which I think, you know, is a challenge, but something that we're really working on. And we're working with the Young Foundation and the ICS who are running this event today to deliver those support packages. So just briefly to tell you where we're up to now, next slide please. So our kind of learning journey continues. So one of the things that we recognised from these programs that we've funded over the last few years is the need to really properly fund communities and partners that are working on these projects, and to do that directly where possible. And this we sort of recognised was a way of achieving that kind of equity that we wanted to see between researchers, between universities and communities or the public, and to, you know, frankly, to not kind of underline that kind of power imbalances that happen when the money all goes to the university, which you know, as you probably know, is the kind of traditional funding model. So alongside the programs that I've just talked about, we're funding these two programs that you can see on screen. We're just about to, we've just started these. Yeah, so they are very much about funding community groups directly. And one of them, the Community Knowledge Fund, is more sort of on the project side of things. The networks is more about focusing on the kind of infrastructure and capacity building, kind of longer term infrastructure support that's needed to build the kind of relationships that we'd like to see between researchers and communities. But as I say, the thing behind them is the funding directly of communities, so that they are able to address the challenges in their place and their communities that matter to them. And both of these programs have a lot of kind of support and capacity building built into them. So it's very much about building those capacity and capabilities of everyone involved in that. So communities and, if you know, research organisations that are involved there. But also that kind of ethos of open and reflective sharing and learning that I've talked about before. So we really kind of want to bake that into the programs. And I'll just briefly finish on, next slide, please. So we, oh, sorry, last slide. Sorry, I think you've missed one. No. Okay, never mind, it doesn't matter. So I had a slide here about the UKRI organisational strategy. So we've just launched our organisational strategy, 5-year strategy, and within that, this kind of the whole organisational strategy has a couple of core goals. One is to break down barriers between research, innovation and wider society, and the other is to involve a broader range of people in the design and delivery of research and innovation. And so I think you can see yeah, so that kind of organisational strategy is now going to be supported by a new public engagement strategy for UKRI, a sort of dedicated strategy for public engagement, which is, as I've said before, is coming hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And it really kind of builds on the learning that I've talked about that we've learned through these programmes. And as you can see, I won't read all of this out, but goal 2 really kind of supports those goals that I talked about in the wider organisational strategy in terms of valuing collaboration and involving more diverse voices. And I think, you know, you can see that goal in particular really kind of speaks to the kind of work that the kind of approach that we're talking about today. And so that goal is really kind of, is about trying to is trying to embed a way of working that can support people directly to be involved in research, to kind of influence and shape research so that they can best meet the needs of their communities. But it's also about us internally thinking about how we can bake that through the work that UKRI does as well, throughout all of our work. And I should say that kind of we're using public engagement within this strategy as a broad umbrella term. So it encompasses lots of different ways in which people can engage with research. So all the different kind of activity that seeks to break down those barriers between research and society that I've talked about, and citizen science or participatory research is one of those activities that we're including under that umbrella. I think I'll finish there, and I will hand over, I think, to Alice.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I'm Alice, as Sean's introduced. I'm a senior researcher at the Young Foundation and Institute for Community Studies, and I'll be telling you a bit more about just one of those many great things UKRI are doing that Jen mentioned, and that's the support package the Institute is providing for the Citizen Science Collaboration Grant teams. So on the next slide, I've got a bit of an overview of what projects are funded. So these are 5 very diverse research projects. They span across lots of different disciplines, grappling with very current and contested projects from mental health to reparative justice and microplastics. They are partnering, these universities mentioned here are partnering with a whole range of different organisations, from museums and health institutes to youth and arts organisations. And they are using a whole range of different methods and approaches, from using microscopes to doing evidence synthesis with youth researchers, and using creative methods such as dance and poetry. Within each of these approaches, some projects teams have more or less affinity with this term sort of citizen science, but at the heart, bringing all of these diverse projects together is a commitment to involving citizens, communities, or people more generally in research. So on the next slide, I've got a bit of an overview of where the Institute comes in, which is to provide a support package to support the learning and collaboration among this cohort, with UKRI included. So this support package means lots of different things, and we are sort of constantly iterating and adapting to tailor our approach to the needs of the teams. But, oh, sorry, okay, can you go back? Yeah, but that diagram on the right shows like a high level of what we are trying to achieve across lots of different strands and with different people. So we work with individuals, with their project teams, and then across the whole cohort to support their learning with various training, workshops and development opportunities. We also bring the cohort together and build this sense of like a space for sharing, to learn from each other and exchange those more nitty-gritty aspects that Helena talked about in her talk, about the complexities and challenges of trying to do this type of work. Going into next year, we'll also have a stream working with the citizen science to again provide them with masterclass opportunities to build their skills even further from what they have been doing in their individual projects, and also bring them together to learn from each other and their experiences doing very different types of research. We'll also be working with them to tell the story of their experiences and asking them what they see for the future of citizen science and this type of research, what they would do differently, and what they hope for the future. At the end of all that learning and sharing, we hope to mobilise all this knowledge, and that involves opening it up to the broader sector and have a conversation, as we are doing today with many of you in the room, aggregating all those learnings that we've shared, and incorporating more and more perspectives to really take this forward and shape UKRI's practice, but also practice more broadly across the sector. So on the next slide, I've got bullet pointed here a few of the common tensions and challenges that we've been identifying through our conversations with the teams. This picks up on some of the stuff we've been hearing from the exploration grant and Jen mentioned in UKRI's broader work. And there's really these tensions that exist with the way that research is usually done, and the institutions it's usually done in, and we've been talking together about how to navigate this and how we shift change in these institutions that have been not doing things in this type of way for a long time. So just on that last slide that I have, I wanted to end quite hopefully about thinking how we can work all together. What we're doing in the collaboration grant is just one small thing of lots of diverse practice going on across lots of different spheres and sectors. So how can we work together to envision that more participatory future and build the infrastructures to shift that institutional change and systemic change we need to see. So I'll pass back to Sian to sort of wrap up our talks and open up the discussion.
Thank you very much to all our speakers there for setting the scene and getting us into a conversation with such interesting talks, looking at both the kind of practical on the ground experience, the kind of funders' journey, and then also what's happening next. So to kick us off, do feel free, I guess, now at this stage, if you've got burning questions, do start putting them in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. But to start us off, I'd really welcome the speakers' reflections on a key theme that's been coming out of the chat as you've been speaking, which is about the definition of citizen science and how it relates to other participatory methods and participatory research. And from looking at the questions that are in the kind of chat, I guess there's different angles to this. So both, I guess, about the value of being specific about what it means in comparison to other forms of participatory methods, but also some of the challenges that exist with the term citizen science and how that can be quite narrow and can have certain connotations. I'd really welcome, I know, Jen, you were talking a little bit about this in your talk, but I'd be open to any of our speakers on their reflections on what we've been learning, what we've been spotting across the sector. Would anyone like to jump in? Jen, go for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, thanks for the question, Grace. So, I mean, I think, to be honest, and Steve's here now, I can see, who's in my team as well. I think I think if we did the latest grant again, we probably wouldn't have called it citizen science. I think we've learned quite a lot since then in terms of, and the call itself did include other terms in the guidance. So, you know, it talked about participatory research, co-production, other types of other terms that we might use for similar work with it, yeah, that were eligible for the funding. But I think, you know, it really does flag this kind of inherent issue that we have with public engagement, but also, you know, with disciplinary work more widely. You know, we fund, as a central team, we fund right across the disciplines, and so it is really tricky for us to find terms that speak to, even public engagement means different things to different disciplines, and participatory research, co-production, etc., citizen science. So I think we have a real challenge there, and we are sort of, as I say, kind of we're generally sort of moving towards using more things like participatory research and co-production. But I do think, you know, that as a sector we have this challenge in terms of how we understand those different terms. Yeah, Steve, I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything else on that. I know it's not a particularly kind of clear answer, but it's, as I say, it's sort of something, I guess, that we are struggling with ourselves. And just to add to that, I suppose, is just that there's a question in there, also a really good question about, you know, isn't citizen science a particular kind of activity? And so I guess, again, you know, we have used citizen science very broadly, that you know, Helen has described as from all the way from the sort of pure data collection, anonymous data, you know, people on the computer sort of collecting data and entering it anonymously, right through to kind of what some of the things they're doing in the collaboration grants now, which is very small number of people kind of really co-producing the research and delivering it with the researchers. And so, you know, we could argue maybe we shouldn't use citizen science for all of those methods, but that, you know, that's something that we're kind of grappling with at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much there, Jen. As you mentioned, it's a complex topic, and it's one that we're hoping to share more about as we explore those tensions about trying to find a kind of definition, indeed, if one is actually kind of useful there. I'm just going to check in with my colleagues from the ICS to see if there's anything they wanted further to add on that topic, based on kind of our experience and conversations to date. Eleanor, I'll come to you.
Yeah, sure. So I thought the point around, isn't citizen science a particular activity is a really, really interesting point, because I think there's a, maybe let's call it classic sort of model of that, which might be the kind of classic count the birds in your back garden sort of citizen science, which is probably very, very familiar to a very large number of people. And I think that familiarity is where, while I personally have some discomfort with the use of the word citizen for various reasons, but I think the fact of citizen science having that level of familiarity does mean that it's useful. It means that many, many people sort of recognize the terminology, and when they're maybe invited to take part, maybe have a kind of sense of what that could mean and what that could look like. But at the same time, certainly having evaluated these 28 very different exploration projects, which ranged from an array of fields, I would say, I suppose, fields that I would call broadly within the sciences, not all of them, but most. So we're talking about, astrophysics, environmental research, some sort of health-based research. But there, they're still doing citizen science, but it is really different. So I personally as well, would be a little bit resistant to seeking a kind of perfect definition and seeking to really pin down exactly what citizen science should or shouldn't mean. And I guess I'd be quite pragmatic with the use of language. And I would say, okay, I might not be particularly comfortable with that language, but equally, if it's useful, if it's recognizable to people, plus, of course, there is now like a body of literature using that language. I would also be reluctant to sort of put it in the bin and let's start calling it something different. I think maybe we can kind of repurpose, language and research methodologies as research in the world evolves.
Thank you very much there both for those reflections. And I see we've got a couple more kind of comments coming in on the chat here around kind of, I guess, the value of actually the practitioners being very kind of clear on actually kind of what that term might mean to them, and about also Jane's kind of raising comments here to do with kind of being sensitive to the fact that different terminology can mean different things or nothing to different communities and people, and so language can be vital. And I guess there's a really interesting point there as well about how we think about what citizen scientists themselves actually might define in terms of actually what they're involved in and how that actually works for them as a term that they recognise about their involvement. Do keep putting your questions in the chat, and also if you have any reflections about the terminology, we'd love to hear from you. Just checking, I guess, yeah, also further comments here in the chat from Leah about the idea of kind of the science might be off-putting to public partners, not as relatable to every day, whereas research feels more encompassing across the different disciplines. Thank you for those thoughts and reflections. Do we have any other questions, which I guess moving away maybe from the terminology question to maybe some of the kind of recommendations and reflections that have been shared across our 3 different talks? Does anyone have any kind of further questions for our panel? If not, I might prompt one to get us started. Yes, Leah, I'll come to you if you want to come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me? I guess it was just thinking about this from a community and public perspective. I guess if you go to any local area where there are lots of, where there's a big university, often an NHS trust, and think about how many kind of asks there are of community groups from loads of different people who are all completely unaware of what the others are doing often. So if you kind of start working in an area, in order to try to understand that, you're looking at probably talking to about 20 different people to get a sense of who's doing what with whom and what relationships are held. And it's really easy to kind of damage relationships that have been built up over a long time by individuals. And I just think there's something that's really interesting. I was really pleased to see the community network infrastructure set up by UKRI. But I guess I'd just like to see the sector go further and really genuinely collaborate across places to make this much more on the terms of communities and much clearer, and just kind of smooth all of that process out, which I know is hugely complicated, but it feels as if, you know, large funders like UKRI are the people to do that. And that's what I think would be massively helpful for everybody involved, and support all that kind of knowledge exchange and best practice. And just, yeah, I think it would just work better for everyone. So that's what I know that's like a massive like vision, but I think, and I can see the steps towards that, but I think working in collaboration with other major funders would be really helpful.
Thank you very much there for your reflections, Leah. I'll just see, I might come over to potentially Steve, maybe from UKRI, for some reflections on that.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. I think, you know, it's nice to hear that you reflect positively on the community research networks, because that's kind of what they're trying to do, but I appreciate that's a kind of small step in that direction. But certainly UKRI is having conversations with other funders who are already and trying to work in that way as well. So with the Ideas Fund at Welcome, and so there are conversations happening to try and join things up better and try and make it a bit more cohesive and consistent, I suppose. So, but like you also say, it takes a bit of time. So we're pushing in that direction. And I think we're going to learn so much from the two things that Jen mentioned, the community research networks and the community knowledge fund. And we just want to make sure we gather as much learning from that and share that with the research councils and our colleagues there, and other funders, and just try and connect all that up. So as, you know, it's not just our small team in working with public engagement, but actually it's much more embedded in research and how we approach research. That's the holy grail. That's the direction we want to go in. That's what our public engagement strategy is pointing towards. It's also what the UKRI strategy points towards. So there is a sense of movement in that direction. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much there, Steve. While we have you off mute, there was a question in the chat just to do with, I guess, linking to other organisations that are working in this space. So, for example, NCCPE, and I was just wondering if you might want to speak a little bit about kind of UKRI's public engagement team's kind of wider work and engagement. I think a piece of work we're actually doing with NCCPE.
I can do, yeah. So we do a lot of work with NCCPE. They're co-funded by UKRI, Research England, the Developed Nations and Welcome. So we do work very closely with them. And I suppose in particular what you're talking about, Sian, is some of the work that we're doing, which is, I suppose, alongside the Community Knowledge Fund and the Community Research Networks, thinking about those individuals that kind of have that important role. Leah touched upon the fact that sometimes these relationships are between individuals rather than between organisations. So how do we support those individuals? And we're hoping to have some work come out, hopefully by the end of the year, that's kind of been exploring that and how we might approach that kind of investment in individuals and supporting wherever they come from, whether they're researchers, you know, brokerage roles, or within communities, supporting them in their development and enabling them to support this way of working.
Thank you very much there, Steve. Do keep your questions coming in on the chat. I'm just going to go to a comment by Jane that I think raises quite an interesting question potentially for our panel about, I guess, the value of this shift towards empowering research capability outside academia, but it brings up questions around impact, robustness and acknowledgement. That's something that I guess we have lots of conversations about as we've been looking at these different programmes. Rather necessarily, I guess looking for actually the fact that this types of research can absolutely have equal standing with other kind of methods, but some of the added value that they can add. We've also, I guess, been spotting that it also maybe flags some of the kind of institutional barriers and difficulties around kind of, I guess, some of these themes. And I was wondering if some of our speakers might want to reflect a little bit on that question around this challenge. Helena, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think, you know, while I didn't talk about this in the presentation I gave, it is absolutely in the report about the kind of CSEG grant evaluation. And I think anybody who's interested in, you know, the quality of citizen science or other participatory research, I would recommend having a look, because what stood out from this evaluation was that the quality of the data, or the quality of the research findings, really across the board was reported as extremely high. And actually, you know, where people had thought, oh, maybe our participants won't be able to do X, Y, or Z, or maybe, you know, this will be a stretch too far for them, they found, if anything, that people could do more than they had expected, and the data quality could be greater than what perhaps had been expected. You know, and this ranges from, can participants collect water samples from a river, and will those samples be as robust and as useful as if trained scientists had collected them? And the answer there was very much yes. And it spans through to, you know, can people make decisions about research that are as robust? And the answer again was yes. But of course, you know, where there was difficulty was, or where researchers were reporting difficulty, I should say, was almost in then convincing others of the quality of this work, or convincing others to use the findings. And again, what that was really interesting to me was, in some projects, the research participants were also able to make suggestions about who to target with the research, how to communicate it. And that again was increasing the impact and increasing the sort of usefulness of actually those research outputs. So I think there are some really, really positive indications, but I do think that it probably is in that communication piece. How do we convince people that research that's coming from whatever participatory method that maybe isn't as controlled, isn't being done in a traditional laboratory, you know, how do we argue for its value? And I think that's where perhaps there is still some challenge for us to work on.
Thank you very much there, Helena. I'll just see if there's any of our panel want to kind of reflect on that question. If not, I'll come to, oh, go for Alice.
I just add in that, like, I think what we have been sort of embracing in a lot of our posts, and what sort of Helena talks about quite a bit, is that value of being really open about the challenges, but that's sort of in tension with what Helena was just touching there about advocating for this. And I think that's something, as like people invested in these types of approaches, that we need to sort of hold that tension about how we can talk about this stuff and encourage others to do it, but also be open about the challenges and help make the ways of working as good as they possibly can be. And yeah, as we've sort of mentioned, we're in the midst of our autumn period of like intensive training now for the collaboration grants, and it's a conversation we were just having yesterday when we were talking about analysis and the different perspectives that involving citizen scientists or community researchers and that can bring, but how in different disciplines particularly that level of subjectivity isn't necessarily the norm and celebrated as much as it would be in other places. So yeah, definitely like live conversations and interesting ones to continue.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much there both. I was on mute there. So we've still got kind of lots. I'm going to extend a little bit just the kind of Q&A section if we've got a little bit of time. So I can spot also in the chat here, we've got a good question here from Helen Featherstone in terms of actually, I guess, a question for our UKRI colleagues about how this learning is being shared across UKRI, but also I guess vice versa in terms of how learning from other kind of disciplines and other bodies is feeding back into it. And I guess just that, how we make sure we're not reinventing the wheel. I might pop that to you, Jen or Steve, whoever would like to come in.
Oh, Steve, do you want to go?
No, you go first, Jen.
Okay, yeah, it's a really good question. So we are a central team. So we, as I said before, we fund right across the disciplines, but we also work really closely with our colleagues across the research councils who look after the different disciplinary areas. And as definitely kind of the strategy is also a really useful focal point as well for us to do that, to kind of get more traction in terms of the value and the kind of profile of public engagement across UKRI. But yeah, we also do work with our colleagues who, as Helen's pointed out, that have a history of using these kind of participatory approaches. So we do that kind of internally, but then we also work with people like the Young Foundation who have this kind of history of, this is a sort of social research, so very much a discipline and an area that have used these kind of participatory researches to make sure that we are learning from them, that we can kind of build that learning into the work that we support. But I guess it's a really, really good point, because I think generally in the area of public engagement, there is this kind of issue of how different disciplines learn from each other. And there's lots of kind of stuff that I think public engagement has drawn from, particularly from social and health research. So things like public involvement, but also things like evaluation, that are very much drawn from things like education, for example. We've kind of we've learned a lot from how we evaluate public engagement activities from disciplines like education and social research. So I think there's always been that kind of culture of learning from different disciplines that as Helen points out, have been using these kind of participatory approaches for many years. And it's definitely something that we're really aware of, and something that we internally really want to build on and make stronger, how we share that learning across UKRI and then share that out to the sector. And I think through people like the NCCP, which have been brought up before, we do kind of, that's one route in which we really want to kind of to bring this learning together and make sure that people can, as you say, use the techniques and the approaches that and the things that haven't worked, the learning around that, what hasn't worked, that's already out there, so we're not reinventing the wheel. But it's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think basically we're building on what others have done before us. So we're trying to make sure we're not reinventing the wheel, but kind of moving things in I was going to say a new direction, but a continual direction, building on what's gone before. So particularly with the work that's been done at AHRC around connected communities, common causes, making sure we're building on those projects and moving the field forward from there, and having conversations with our colleagues in the research councils that worked on those projects. So that the colleagues that worked on in AHRC and how they're moving these things forward. So I think it's not just the public engagement team centrally that's working in this way. There are a number of projects funded through particularly AHRC and ESRC who are looking to work in this way, and bring in the conversations with communities and the public. I suppose the other thing is thinking about those other agendas. There's another question around anti-racism and thinking about what UKRI is doing around EDI and inclusive research, and trying to embed that into the kind of research culture of we're talking about engaging with different stakeholders and making sure that the public is a stakeholder seen in the same light as policymakers and others. So there's building on that. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to mention was just the public engagement strategy, as you'll see next week when it comes out, is trying to embed a lot of this stuff into how research is done. And we recognise that sometimes the way that we fund research and the way that we work as a funding organisation puts up barriers to that process. So we're looking to see our internal processes. So what do we learn from the stuff that we've done with the citizen science grants, and what are we going to learn with the work we're doing with communities? How do we take that back in and go, how does our organisation need to change to enable this to happen? Believe you me, we have had lots of challenges to try and fund this way within our organisation. So a big programme of work, which is a little bit invisible, but it is happening, is thinking, well, how does UKRI practice what it preaches. So how do we ensure that public engagement is embedded in how we work? But also, how do we ensure that we are enabling and supporting the people that we fund to do public engagement and involve the public appropriately in the work that they do? So that's all stuff that's happening. Once again, it takes a bit of time, but the good thing is we're having those conversations and making those challenges to ourselves about how we can embed this work in what we do.
Thank you very much there all. I'm conscious that we've reached the end of our time, I guess, this first session in terms of our kind of with our panel with the short talks and also the webinar, but there are comments and reflections still coming through with the chat. What I'd like to do is, I guess, just at this stage is to thank our speakers for their time and their reflections. And a reflection just from listening to the conversations is, I guess, the real value, I think, was flagged by across everyone about the real value in consolidating the learning behind these approaches. And that does create a bit of a tension around, I guess, the real kind of value of sharing the learning of what isn't working, what could be improved, actually some of the nitty-gritty of it, but also in a way the value of advocating for these types of methods as well. And I can see real appetite in the kind of chat around actually how do we do that and enable that kind of shift so these methods are not just seen as valuable, but also are spread out throughout different institutions as we think about that shift towards involving citizens much more strongly in research. Conscious that there are people in this room that do this day in, day out, and we would love to make the most of your time now today. And so we'll shift shortly into a more kind of networking breakout space to allow the conversation to continue. So we have been recording the session, and we will make the recording available after in terms of these key speaking, and we will also circulate the slides as necessary as well, so that you have them there. There are also a couple of documents as well that are useful. So as mentioned by Jen and Steve, the forthcoming public engagement strategy, as well as the evaluation that Helena took us forward through. And we're also sharing further learning as we go from the different collaboration grants. This event is part of a series of events that we run every month. Some of you may be coming to one of these for the first time. So I would say is we are constantly publishing as the Young Foundation Institute for Community Studies as part of our peer research network, learning about the kind of nature of participatory research and sharing these learnings. So do sign up for our network to give access to further talks and themes like this. But to bring this section to a close and to move us on, as I mentioned, if we were normally, I guess, in person, we would love at this stage to kind of move us into the kitchen, into our kind of downstairs area and continue the conversation. I'm very conscious that while we've heard from some wonderful speakers who are very knowledgeable, there's so much knowledge in this room and we'd love to kind of make the most of that. So what I'll do shortly is my colleague Alice in the background has been setting up some breakout rooms to create some smaller spaces to allow the conversation to continue. Obviously, feel free to kind of talk about some of the themes that have come up from today's conversations, what's emerging for you, particularly that theme about actually how do we define citizen science, what's the best term. But we also offer up a bit of a conversation menu too, to pick up on some of the themes that Helena raised earlier around these new frontiers in participatory research and citizen science. So you might want to discuss with colleagues in the room about your reflections on the future of citizen scientists, on citizen science. How do we really enable and make sure we're shifting those power dynamics and amplifying citizen science voices and enabling them, as well as some of the kind of barriers and enablers of these types of methods. Shortly we will move you through into breakout rooms. Depending on numbers, we might shift and change things around as we go through the next hour or so, but we'll start off with the initial kind of breakout rooms, groups set up, and we'll see how we go.